Okay, so we are going to change the order of the lectures a little bit. I'm going to do chapter 24 in two parts, which is this right here, and then chapter 25 will be one part, which will be about reproduction because it's only 10 slides. So this is going to be kind of in two parts, maybe 2/3 and 1/3, and then you'll have the rest of the lecture in chapter 25 on a different day. And then we'll finish up with chapter 26. So we're going to talk about human biology, control, and development. And the things that we're going to see are how the body's organized, what homeostasis is, the brain, the nervous system, how neurons work, action potentials, endorphins, your senses, your hormones, reproduction, development, skeleton, and muscles. And so it's going to just be kind of a brief overview, not very specific about any of these things, I would say. So kind of a superficial understanding. So organization of the human body. If you think back to our 5 big ideas of learning, organization was one of them, and the way the body is organized, systems within an overall body, it's one of those big ideas. So the many processes that occur in our body require coordination. So breathing in, your brain telling your body to breathe in requires coordination, as well as your lungs doing what they're supposed to do, your diaphragm, and then exhaling, eating, moving. It all takes coordination, otherwise something doesn't go correctly. So cells achieve this coordination, so on like a cellular level, by working together in structures with varying level of complexity. So tissues are kind of the fundamental level, the basic level. And then tissues make up organs, and organs will work together. And then organ systems are like your circulatory system or your lymphatic system that are working together. And so please make sure you're taking handwritten notes as you're going through on these last couple of lessons. So in your body, you have 10 major organ systems, and you need to know the 10 major types. We're not going to talk about them all in great detail, but we are going to cover the ones that are things that you're supposed to know or things that you have to know about, so we can talk about genetics. So the nervous system, your endocrine system, reproductive, sensory, muscular, skeleton, circulatory, respiratory, digestive, immune, and excretory. They all have their own unique purpose, but they do overlap in ways like your heart and your which is your main organ that pumps your blood, so it's part of your circulatory system, but your circulatory system is also going to be part of your immune system and or your blood vessels. So there is overlap. They're not islands working by themselves. They are areas where the organ systems are going to share responsibilities and therefore have to work together. So homeostasis is what your body desires. It's the maintenance of a stable internal environment, and anything other than homeostasis is disease, whether that's like a virus, bacteria, cancer, an infection with like a fungal infection, or any sort of deviation from normal is not being at homeostasis. So some examples of what homeostasis looks like to us is temperature control. Our body naturally maintains the 98.6 degrees unless you are sick in some way or you're hypothermic, and if you go outside and it's too cold, you become hypothermic, which your body then struggles to maintain its temperature. But normally we are endothermic. We regulate our own temperature. We don't need a heat lamp. Though we do like the sun, we don't need the sun to stay warm. The oxygen level in your body, so if you've ever been to the doctor, they put the little thing on your finger which measures your oxygen saturation, should be around, high 90s, 100%. And so that's necessary. If you fall below a certain amount, your body's not getting enough oxygen, and your organs can start to die or starve of oxygen. The amount of water in the body, so you are taking in water through your mouth by drinking, and you are excreting it through urine, which is part of your excretory system, but your body maintains a certain level. So if you're not drinking water, eventually you stop peeing because your body's trying to hold on to the water it has. The concentration of ions inside and outside your cell, so this is diffusion that we talked about before. Your blood pH, so it's important that your pH of your blood stays right around I think it's 7.2 or 7.4. Anything that deviates from that could be a sign of disease. In cancer, we see that the cells tend to be hypoxic, and so they have a higher pH than what we see in normal cells. So the brain is it's something that sets us apart. So you see here, this is a cartoon image of the brain with the certain functions that are labeled. So we have the cerebrum, which is the top part, the cerebral cortex, you have your cerebellum, which is the back part, your spinal cord, which is at the bottom of the base of the brain and then runs all the way through your spinal column, protected by your bones. You have the brain stem. You have your thalamus, your hypothalamus, pituitary gland. Now within the cerebrum, you have certain places which are responsible for certain functions, like the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, temporal lobe, which is on the sides, and the occipital lobe, which is the back. So last November, I was diagnosed with Chiari malformation, which is where my cerebral tonsils, which are down there in the purple part of your brain, were shoved down into my spinal cord. And so what I was getting was occipital headaches, which are from the back of my head, that were radiating all across because of the brain compression. But because of the compression, I was having other symptoms that associated with other parts of my brain, like I was having weird vision things and I was really dizzy. And so these are things that are associated with like your occipital part of your brain, your frontal part of your brain, the tinnitus. I have tinnitus, so I have ringing in my ears. There were just a bunch of things that were going on, heart palpitations, which all originated to a very small portion of my brain being compressed. And so with the brain, we know that it's very sensitive to any sort of pressure changes, brain traumas, things like that, bruising, bleeding, that it's responsible for a lot of our motor things, the things we don't even think about having to do, breathing, walking, not touching something when it's hot. So any sort of damage to an aspect of the brain, especially if it damages nerves, is going to take time to heal. It's not like a cut on your hand, which can heal faster. Nerves take a lot longer to heal. The other thing that makes our brains unique is that you see here all the folds. So animals like sheep, which are not very bright, have smoother brains. They don't have as many wrinkles in their brains. And what the wrinkles do is provide us a large surface area, and that large surface area allows us to be smarter and to think more and to react more. And so the wrinkles in our brain are important. And it's why you see in smooth-brained animals, which tend to be what we would call not intelligent, they lack the wrinkles that we do. So that sets us apart a little bit from other mammals. So the brainstem, the part that's right there at the base of your skull, controls involuntary activities such as heartbeat, respiration, and digestion. So if you've ever known someone that's passed out when they're giving blood or anything like that, they get too overwhelmed, that's called a vagal response, VAGAL, and that has something to do with the brainstem being compressed or just the pressure increasing so much that there's compression and you pass out, you black out. The cerebellum, which is that purple part of the brain, controls balance, posture, coordination, and fine motor control. So for me, that was the part of my brain that I was struggling the most with because of the compression on those tonsils that extend down below the cerebellum. The cerebrum is the rest, the big part that's like a helmet on top, the largest part of your brain. It receives all the information from your senses, controls all of your conscious and voluntary activities, so the things you don't intend to do and the things you have to think about doing, like picking your arm up. Your arm doesn't just randomly pick up. Your brain has to tell it to pick up. But there's some things that your body does that are considered to be voluntary. So if you have a random twitch, you didn't tell your body to twitch. It twitched all on its own for another reason, not based on your thought process. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, which is odd to think about it, but when your right hand is moving, that's controlled by things coming from, or signals coming from the left side of your brain, and when your left hand moves, that's coming from the right side of your brain. And so you may hear people talk about left brain and right brained people. and what they tend to be more about, art versus analytical. I don't know how true that is, but anyway, so people who write with their right hand, those things are coming, the signals are coming from your left hemisphere. If you are left-handed, those signals are coming from your right hemisphere. In the cerebrum, you also have information processing in the cerebral cortex, which is that thin wrinkled layer covering the cerebrum. So the ability that we are able to think about things so quickly and make decisions, it means we have a faster fight or flight response. We can communicate at a higher level. We can learn. We can make decisions. Those are all thanks to those wrinkles in our brain. The four lobes, you have the frontal lobe, which is responsible for reasoning, control of voluntary movement, and speech. So people who've had a traumatic brain injury to the front of their head would need probably some sort of speech therapy or learning how to breathe again. Things like that would come from damage in the frontal lobe of the brain. The parietal lobe, which is the side, is where temperature, touch, taste, and pain come from. So it has a lot to do with your senses. Your physical senses. The occipital lobe at the back takes in your visual information. So damage to the back of that brain might result in damages to your ability to either see or interpret visual information. Your temporal lobes, which are right there, let's go back and look, temporal lobes right there along kind of the base, right above your ears. Where did it go? Okay. This is where sound language comprehension comes in. So not the ability to speak, but the ability to hear and interpret that in your brain. So you can see that speech is the ability to talk comes from the front, but the ability to understand that language comes from the side. So no one part of the brain controls any one sense. It's kind of a combination of both. Memory, long-term, short-term memory, things like that all come from different parts, which is a smart adaptation or design in our brain, because it means if you have damage to one side, whether it be from an aneurysm or a traumatic accident, you could still regain some function in another way, but it may not be 100% of what it was before. So the control of certain cognitive functions is dominated either by your right or left hemisphere. The left hemisphere, this is your math, reasoning, language, detail-oriented activities. Right hemisphere is spatial relations, emotional processing, and music. So it's kind of strange to think about it, but people who are inclined to music, they would be using those talents from the right hemisphere, and then your left hemisphere would be more of like your analytical type person, the math, things like that. But it's interesting to me because there's other things that have an impact on this, because people who are, studies show that people who are involved in music and can read music are actually better at math. And so I don't really know that it's as clear cut as saying if you're right brain you're artistic and if you're left brain you're good at math. But the ability to do these things comes from different parts of our brains. Okay, so your thalamus. Your thalamus, which is not a piece that we had labeled here that you could see very clearly, but it's almost right there in the very center. It's kind of that circular area of the brain. And so, let's go back to it. Your thalamus receives the information from many parts of the brain, so it takes all the stuff that's happening on the outside and it gets sent to the very center. So it's very well protected in the center of your brain. And it's going to sort it and pass that information on to the cerebral cortex where it needs to go. So it's like your post office. It's receiving all the information, sorting it out, and then distributing it where it needs to go. Your hypothalamus, on the other hand, which is beneath the thalamus, hypo means low, so it's right below the thalamus. The hypothalamus is going to control a lot of really important things to the rest of the body. Your emotions, such as pleasure and rage. Your bodily drive, such as hunger, thirst, sex drive, your body temperature, your blood pressure, your internal clock, and your release of hormones. So when they're looking at your hormones levels in your blood, if you've ever had that blood work done, they're looking like T3, T4, TSH, these are thyroid hormones. That control comes from the hypothalamus. So if you are having some sort of malfunction with your hormones, sometimes they'll come back, if it's not your thyroid, they'll come back and look at your hypothalamus and see, is there a tumor or something else going on there, an aneurysm that might be causing the hypothalamus not to control, not to send out the signal saying, hey, make this hormone, or wake up at this time, or control my temperature. So if you have malfunctions with these things, these fundamental things you don't have to think about doing, then there could be an issue with the hypothalamus. So you don't tell your body that you need to make estrogen or make testosterone. Your body just does it. All right, so nervous system. It consists of two parts. They both are responsible for different things. So your central nervous system is your brain and then your spinal cord. Okay. The peripheral nervous system is everything else that originates out from that, and that is everything other than the brain and the spinal cord. So for me, whenever I had my Chiari malformation, that was a central nervous system problem. And so because there was an impact on the central nervous system, it impacted a lot of other functions that get their initial information from your central nervous system. Now, in your nervous system, you have two types of cells, the neurons and the glial cells. The neurons are what receive and transmit electrical impulses, so they are like the highway that your information goes down. They're the ones that are transmitting the information. Your glial cells support, protect, and insulate the neurons. So sometimes there's an issue with, if you think about diseases that are neurodegenerative, things like muscular dystrophy or muscular sclerosis or multiple sclerosis, those are problems that have some sort of origin in the nervous system, usually the central nervous system. And sometimes that's the glial cells losing their ability to insulate the neurons, and so the neurons can't carry the signal. The signal gets lost in the highway of information because the glial cells aren't there to protect that information. It's like trying to send 500 $1 bills through the mail without putting it in an envelope. If you just put it in the mail and expect that it's going to make it to where you want it, it may eventually get there if you fold it up in a piece of paper and put an address on it, but you may not have $500. It may be $400 because $100 bills scattered across the highway on the way there. And that's what happens when your glial cells stop doing what they're supposed to do. So a typical neuron consists of extensions called a dendrite, a cell body, and an axon. So there are three parts of the neuron cell. The dendrites, we see here, they're kind of like little tree roots. They receive the information from all the neurons that they're connected to, and they go into the nucleus, and then they transport down the axon to the next cell. And so it's going to be received by the dendrite, travel through the yellow tail into the axon terminals, where it then will enter into another dendrite and then pass along the axon. So depending on the origin and destination of the messages, neurons are divided into three categories based on what kind of messages they're passing. You have sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. Okay, so you may have heard of motor neurons before. Oh, my Siri just woke up. Not talking to you, Siri. And so sensory neurons are the ones that are going to carry the messages from the senses to the central nervous system. So they're going to, for example, you touch the stove and it's hot. Your finger is hot, but that signal is going to travel all the way from your hand, up your arm, through the sensory neuron channels, and it's going to hit your brain. Your brain's going to say, move your hand off. That's hot. Don't do it again. The interneurons are found only in the central nervous system, so only within your brain and your spinal cord. Okay, so they're inside. That's what inter usually means, within your central nervous system. So the interneurons are what's in your brain and what's in your spinal cord. And they connect all the neurons together. The motor neurons are going to be messages that go from the central nervous system to the rest of the body. So let's go back to our hot stove. The sensory neurons are going to take that information, Once it hits your brain, it's going to travel through to the part that says, move, silly. And then once that brain tells the cells, you need to tell the person to move their hand, it's going to travel along the motor neuron pathway until so that you know to pick your hand up. It's going to say, flex that bicep and get the hand off the stove. All right, more nervous system. We're going to spend most time probably talking about nervous system than the other ones. There are two types of motor neurons, the somatic nervous system, which controls your voluntary actions, and your autonomic nervous system, which controls your involuntary muscles and your internal organs. So somatic nervous system would be raise my right foot, put my right foot down, raise my right arm, put my right arm down. Autonomic nervous system is involuntary. You're not thinking about it, and it's also going to include your internal organs, because you don't sit there and focus and say, digest that, what did I just say to Milky Way? Digest that Milky Way. Digest the Milky Way. I don't have to tell my stomach to do that. And I usually don't have to tell my throat to swallow the food that I'm eating. Those muscles work all on their own, but my brain is controlling that, even though I'm not thinking about it. Okay, so we have somatic and autonomic. Now, within the autonomic nervous system, there are two important decisions, and you guys are probably so familiar with this. Your sympathetic is your fight or flight response. If you are somebody who deals with anxiety, with anxious thoughts, I have both of those. I have a heightened sympathetic system. I tend to be on the fight or flight response more often than most people. Some of that is due to the damage, or any damage that might have been done in surgery, might have been done before my surgery, stuff that's healing now. But there was for a long time where my fight or flight response was just through the roof, and it was very hard to function. Okay, so we see here the guy running away. That's flight. He's not fighting the bull. Some of the responses would be your pupils are going to dilate on the right-hand side. They're going to dilate, get really big. You're going to stop producing saliva. Your bronchi is going to relax. Your heart rate is going to accelerate. You're going to have an epinephrine response stimulated, which is basically run. Your glucose is going to be stimulated to be released, so you're going to get a lot of fuel in your body. Your stomach, pancreas, intestines are going to wait, did I just lose my thing? Okay, there we go. Are going to inhibit, and then your urination, so intestines that, and then it says promotes ejaculation and vaginal contractions. I don't really know much about the reproductive system to speak further on that. Now, all of this is going to come along the right-hand side, and you can see all the organs that are responsible for making that happen, and it happens all at once. Now, the parasympathetic response is going to be what operates in times of relaxation. So, when you are doing yoga or meditating or sleeping or doing something that you enjoy where you feel very relaxed and your body feels very relaxed, that's when your parasympathetic response is high. And that's why people who have anxiety and have anxious thoughts, that's why they tell you should meditate or go outside or, do something, one, to distract your brain, but two, to help to kick in this parasympathetic part of your system that might take over and kind of quiet down your sympathetic response. So your pupils are going to constrict, your saliva production is going to be increased, your bronchi are going to be constricted, your heart's rate will slow down, stimulates your stomach, pancreas, intestines, so you'll probably be hungry, stimulates the urination, promotes the erection of genitalia. Again, I don't know enough about reproductive system to tell you much about those responses. I am a chemist, but I do understand the other parts of the biology of this. So you do need to know kind of the different breakdowns of the systems. So we talked about your brain and your spinal cord. Let's make sure we go back and not miss it. Where do we start? Right here. Your central, your peripheral. Then once we got into the different types of neurons and what they're doing, And then we talked about 2 different types of motor neurons. And then we had 2 different types of the autonomic nervous system. So make sure you know kind of those breakdowns, what an example of those would be, how they're defined, things like that. Okay, so how neurons work. A neuron must be stimulated in order to fire. Okay, so healthy neurons don't fire all on their own. A neuron is going to be stimulated when its membrane potential is reached. So this is kind of like the floodgates. The water is going to reach a certain level where it's stimulated, and then the water will overflow. But in this case, the neuron will begin to work. If the membrane potential reaches a certain threshold value, sodium channels are going to open up, rush into the cell, and the membrane potential spikes, creating an action potential, which then cascades everything. Okay, so if we think about what that might look like, if we have this image on the right hand side, you have a sodium channel and a potassium channel, so it's called a sodium-potassium pump, and you have sodium on the outside, and B, it's going to enter in, and then you're going to have this spike in this action potential where eventually enough sodium is going to activate, and it's going to spike. And once it spikes, it very quickly goes back down, and then the next neuron spikes, and the next neuron spikes, and the next one. And so if you are a Grey's Anatomy fan and you are keeping up with the season, they were going to do something. They were testing Richard Weber's nerves by using some sort of electrically stimulating device. And what they're looking for is places where the action potentials were not working properly because he wasn't feeling the zap from the electro-stimulating device. And so that's essentially kind of what they were doing, is trying to simulate this spike. Action potentials are all or nothing, meaning the neuron fires, it's healthy, or it doesn't fire and it's not healthy at all. A neuron cannot fire harder in response to a stronger stimulus, but it can fire more frequently. So if you touch a stove for a little bit of time, it's going to provide as much of a get your hand off this as fast as you can response as if you held your hand there for a long time. It's not that the response is harder, it's just firing more often, which your brain then can perceive as that's a bigger response, get my hand off. So it's kind of in response to the size of the danger. All right, so your neurons are going to be protected in what's called a myelin sheath. Hold on. My boss is messaging me. So myelin sheaths are going to speed the movement of a signal by insulating the axon. So the myelin sheath is made up of glial cells, or these little green things right here. The disease, like multiple sclerosis, causes the body to destroy the myelin. So it attacks it and basically eats away at it so that the axon loses that insulation and it's not able to pass along the signal as efficiently. Eventually, it'll stop passing the signal along altogether. At the end of the axon, the neuron connects with the target cell, either another neuron or a cell that does something like your muscle, your brain, something like that. The connection that occurs between neurons and their target cells are called synapses. Here's another image of your neuron. You have the axon coming in from the top, your receiving dendrite right here on the bottom side, and you have the connection between them. They're not exactly connected directly, but they're in close contact where whatever is released from one side is going to be received by the other. All right, so we'll talk about endorphins, and then we'll take a break and come back and do some about senses, and then reproduction, I think, and then skeletal muscles, okay? All right, so endorphins are important because they bind to your opiate receptors on neurons. Like opiates, endorphins will decrease sensitivity to pain and induce euphoria. So people who like run and work out, they'll say like, I have a runner's high. Well, that's your body has released a lot of endorphins, makes it feel good. And then opiates, that is, of course, it's an illegal drug. Things like heroin, but you can, there are prescriptions that behave similar to opioids opiates. I cannot say it right. Well, anyways, opiates. There we go. Endorphins released is associated with many activities. Runner's high. If you're not a runner, that's okay, because eating chocolate does the same thing, as does meditation. So the release of endorphins is associated with your parasympathetic response, whereas things like cortisol, which is a stress hormone, is associated with a higher level of your sympathetic response, which is that high stress response. Okay, so this is part 1. We'll come back and do part 2, and then you'll be done with your body systems, and then we'll have reproduction, and then you'll have genetics. So we are getting to the end.